Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to start this evening with a confession. We're joined by Nicky Gumbel, and my confession, Nicky, before we get started, is that I should let you know that I'm a frustrated religious affairs correspondent. My dream job is to be the religious affairs correspondent of the New Yorker, writing 2 or 3 pieces a year, which are sort of these great thoughts on what's the place of faith in modern life.
It's not too late, James. You're young.
No. This might well be an audition. I might be auditioning right here. But for those of you who don't know, in many ways, I think you, Nicky, are one of the most influential religious figures in the UK, in some ways globally, partly because you have a recipe of Christianity that really appeals to people, has devotees, people whose lives have been transformed by it and who make the case for it at a time where certainly in, if you like, metropolitan London or in the UK of these times, it can be deeply unfashionable. And so in terms of your own relationship with your church, Holy Trinity Brompton, with the course that you developed, the Alpha course, but also with your interaction with, people of faith, people of none, obviously the Church of England, we hope that we can do what we do in these think-ins, which is have a really open conversation. I should let everyone know that we've just had the most, even by the chaotic standards of green rooms, the most chaotic preparatory conversation, didn't we, Nicky, which was just really a gossip about family history. So I hope we'll get into that. And in fact, I was thinking, Nicky, why don't we start there? Why don't you just tell us, because those people who know you as a prominent figure in Christian life are always amazed by your family story. Why don't you start there?
Yeah, thanks, James. Well, I think it's quite similar to yours in many ways, although I'm much older than you. So it's my parents rather than for you, I think it was your grandparents who came to this country from Germany in the 1930s. My father was a German Jew. He was an agnostic. So I wasn't brought up as a churchgoer. My father was born in 1903 in Stuttgart, and I've really only discovered about his life prior to his marriage in the last few years, because when I was 14, my mother took my sister and I for a walk on the promenade in Brighton, and we both remember it, absolutely verbatim. She said to us, "Your father is German and Jewish, and you are never to speak to him about it." And we never, ever did. And because every conversation would lead back to that, it made it virtually impossible to talk about anything apart from the weather. So that was the only topic of conversation really I ever had with my father, who I adored actually. But I've since
and Nicky, forgive me for interrupting. Was he, because you're kind of, I don't know what the right phrase is, but your awakening to Christianity was at, I think, 18, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Was he still alive then?
Yes, he was still alive. Yeah.
And what did he make of it?
I think I don't really know, because again, we didn't really talk about anything that meant anything. I think, my father was a barrister, and his father was a barrister. And he didn't think there was any other career that anyone could do apart from being a barrister. If I'd been a solicitor, he would have been deeply disappointed. If I'd been a doctor, he would have been horrified. It's only a barrister. And I think my faith made him worried that I might do something other than be a barrister. I was a barrister for a few years, but I think that was his biggest worry. And I think he said things to his sister, probably, which were less sort of against faith. But he always said, "I'm an agnostic." And it was really a sort of humility. I know nothing about anything. I really don't know. And I look back at my father, and I had to more and more. I loved him hugely when he was alive, but I have more and more respect for someone who I think was going through real trauma. And now we're discovering people who are starting to speak about what they experienced in the Holocaust, like 70 years on, because they finally able to speak about it. I think it was too early for him. He died in 1981. it was only, that was only 36, is that right? 36 years after. They hadn't recovered by then. They hadn't overcome the trauma enough to speak about it. I mean, he lost so many of his family in they didn't just die like in a car crash. They died in the most horrific ways. And probably most of his friends died in that way. And how do you ever recover from that?
We had the most extraordinary story, I should just say to you, last night, Nicky. Even last night, a couple of friends and I were talking about our parents' generation and that experience of being the children of survivors of the Holocaust and the psychological impacts that has.
Yes.
I should say one thing before we sort of really get stuck into things properly, which is I have good friends who are members of your church family whose lives have been transformed by Alpha. But I also, to be honest with you, don't really know how it works. ThinkIns work like this, which is we want to try and get as many people to voice their views. We want this to be a forum for civilized disagreement. So I just want to make sure that people know, if you've got something to say, register in the chat, just say to me, oh, I'd like to put this point to Nicky, or, to weigh in. And if you want to say something or just raise your digital hand, I'll make sure to bring you in. So this won't be just a sort of kind of higher-minded version of Morecambe and Wise, me and talking to each other. We'll try and make sure that we get as many voices in as possible. So do just wave at me and I'll bring you in. But Nicky, can we just go to the sort of heart of it, really? Yeah. Which is, why do you think the Alpha course has won so many devotees? Or if you like, the nastier journalistic way of asking the question is, why do you think the Church of England is losing so many people from its pews?
Well, I mean, my experience was, having come from that background of a mother that didn't go to church, a father who was an agnostic, I encountered Jesus through reading the New Testament in my first year at university. And it was like as if the person of Jesus emerged, the person I was reading about emerged from the pages, and I encountered him. And I just had a passion, really, to tell other people about what I'd experienced, because it's like, I suppose if you were in a desert and you find water, you'd feel quite selfish if you just drank it yourself and didn't tell anyone. And I found life has not always been easy, but Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it in all its fullness. And that's what I discovered. And I wanted to find a way to pass that on. And I tried so many things, which I look back on with huge embarrassment. I went around knocking on people's doors. I had questionnaires on the street, which started, first question, what did you have for breakfast? Last question, would you like to ask Jesus into your life? And it was crass and it was embarrassing. And I'm sure it put lots of people off. But I was looking for a way to try and help people who were like me, searching, but not knowing they were searching. I mean, I had no concept I was searching. All I knew was I wasn't, nothing quite satisfied. It was
and Nicky, forgive me, is your when you use this phrase, I encountered him, is your reading of the New Testament and your experience of Jesus Christ literal, i.e. he was a person who lived, who was the Son of God, or is the Son of God? Do you read it literally or symbolically?
No, I read it that he, I mean, I was an atheist. I became an atheist as a teenager. So I wasn't, my father was an agnostic, but I became an atheist because I just could not, I won't bore you with but I became a logical determinist, as I call myself. And I wrote and argued against Christianity, and I felt very strongly about it. And I don't believe that you can prove that there's a God in a way that, like a mathematical formula, 2 + 2 = 4. It's much more like love. It's something that you experience. And what I experienced was an encounter with the risen Jesus. I came to believe that Jesus did actually die and was raised to life. And that therefore, and that suggested that this world has a creator, and that creator is to be understood in terms of Jesus. So that's how I came to it. I don't think philosophical proofs of the existence of God work, or any of the other ways. I think it's, for me, it's the resurrection of Jesus that I looked at as a lawyer. I just looked at the evidence, and law, as you know, you don't. When you put a case to a jury, it's not the same as a mathematical proof or a scientific proof or a philosophical proof. It's evidence. It's history. You put to the jury, these are the facts, and the jury take a step of faith. They don't actually know. They weren't there. They have to listen to the evidence and take a step of faith. And for me, it was like that. It was like, it wasn't irrational any more than a jury deciding, coming back with a verdict is irrational. It's based on evidence, but it's still a step of faith. You don't actually know. And for me, it was that. It was a step of faith based on evidence. And it was an encounter with, it was an encounter with a person, not literally in the sense that I physically saw Jesus, but I knew that he was real. And I found something that completely radically changed my life. And it was like, it's now 40 something years ago. It still changes my life every day. So it was a very powerful experience. And I wanted others to experience that. And
can I just ask you I'm sorry for interrupting, Nicky, but the flip side of it, right? I mean, fun enough, as you describe it, not something that you can prove, but something you experience, yes. Love. I mean, I'm reminded when I was doing my bar mitzvah, my rabbi, when I asked him, are you sure you believe in God? And he sort of shifted uneasily in his seat. And then I said, well, what is God? And his view was, and I think he knew the audience he was speaking to, he said, well, God is like, have you seen Star Wars? He said, God is like the Force in Star Wars. and it was the perfect pitch in some ways, because it defined the idea of a power, and a power that people perceive as for good, but not necessarily in a way that was easy to nail down. I guess I just wanted to pursue the question I was asking about the other side of the equation, why it is that, given the way in which you see it, given the way that you talk about the experience of love, that is a declining force in society, when everything you would think suggests that we want those forces that bring us together, the inspiration. Why is that? Why is the Church of England struggling to do that?
Well, I think when you say declining force in society, it is in the West.
In the Western one, I appreciate it.
But if there were 10 people on the planet, only one would be Western. And Christianity, the fascinating thing about Christianity, and what makes it different from any other religion, is all the other religions are centered on the place where they're founded, whereas Christianity moves. It started in Jerusalem. It moved to Alexandria, it moves to Rome, it moves, I suppose you could say, in more recent history, Britain at one point saw itself as the kind of center, now America, but now it's shifting, and it's shifting to the global south. So the number of Christians, of 2.3 billion Christians, has stayed pretty constant in the last 100 years, but it's shifted from the north to the south. So yes, it's been in decline in Western Europe, but it has been rising hugely in Africa, China, Asia, and its center is shifting from the west to the east and from the north to the south. So there's a huge growth. Western Europe has sort of, secularism has taken quite a hold. And the decline in the Church of England, I mean, it's interesting because, even 50 years ago, I think people went to church because they felt they should. There was a sort of almost a guilt if you didn't go to church. If you said to somebody, do you go to church? They'd be slightly embarrassed to say no. Now young people are embarrassed to say yeah. People lie about why they're doing the Alpha course. They say they're learning French on Wednesday evenings because they're embarrassed to say that they go to church. So what does that mean? It means the people who come are really committed. They've had a real experience. They have a passion. It's much more like the early church. You know, in the early church, if you said you were a Christian, you were likely to die or be tortured. So there was a cost to it.
But I guess, Nicky, I'm interested to know, and I appreciate your point about the way in which the church is moving globally. And I often feel that too much in our media anyway, we miss what's happening in the world.
Yes.
But in the West and in the UK itself, I'd like to just dwell on that for a minute, if I might, because I think that everyone in different ways has had a period of reflection, very difficult, often painful reflection in the last year and a half.
Yeah.
And some of the questions are about the way in which society works. And it must be the case that you look at the popularity, the success of the Alpha Course, and then also the, as you say, the kind of reservations that people have about talking about being Christian publicly, and think there's a deeper problem here. How do we restore a kind of respectability to faith in society, and rather than make it, if you like, a kind of niche exercise? And I wonder how you think about changing things in that regard.
Well, is it a good thing, James, for it to be respectable? Is it actually a healthier thing for it to be something that, because it was not respectable for Jesus. It wasn't respectable for the disciples. It was like they were going against the culture in what they were saying.
Okay, but so if you're saying, okay, well, there is something about being Christian that's an act of rebellion.
It's countercultural. It's countercultural. So there are things that overlap with the culture, and there's certain things that we believe that the Christian. I mean, climate change is one of the things that Christians should be at the forefront of. Climate change, racial justice, wholeness. All these kind of things. There's certain things that Christians should be absolutely at the forefront and overlapping with what the secular world is fighting for in terms. But there are other areas where it is totally countercultural. The whole idea that you might want to tell someone that the culture is like everyone has their own truth. There is no such thing as objective truth. And who are you to suggest to anybody else that they should believe something different from what they believe? That is totally countercultural. Jesus said, go and make disciples of all nations. That is totally countercultural. So it's, and as the culture has shifted, so, I mean, if you look at the church, it was very countercultural until Constantine. And then it became the culture. Was it a good thing that happened? Did it actually strengthen the church? Yeah,
okay, but so there are two different elements. So by the way, I'm going to start bringing some people in, if I might, because I'd love to hear, I'd love to hear what Emma Jackson thinks, and if I might, I'm going to bring in Andrew Brown, who's obviously covered this area. But can I just pick up on those two things? They're totally fascinating to me. One is, how much is the Church of England itself burdened by being a part of the establishment? I mean, quite formally a part of the establishment. I'd love to know what you think of that. And I'd also love to know what you would say, Nicky, to young people who are like, give me a break. You can't claim that Christianity is an act of rebellion when, for us generationally, identity, gender identity, sexuality, actually, what if I'm a kind of Republican anti-monarchist, young person, the church in so many ways embodies the old school. So I'd love to hear what you think institutionally, but also in terms of modern identities, how you make the case for Christianity being countercultural or an act of rebellion.
Well, I mean, the Church of England being part of the establishment and being established, I think, I mean, I can see a very good reasons why the establishment might want to get rid of the Church of England. I can see no good reason why the Church of England should want to distance itself from the establishment, because it seems to me it's only advantageous to be so closely linked to to have influence in the House of Lords, for example, for the bishops to be able to speak there. Why would you want to give that up? I can very well see why they might say, we, in a multicultural society, we no longer want you here. But for the Church of England to do that to itself, I think would be very sad. But as far as being countercultural, I think it's because the culture has moved in the West, very far away from its Christian roots. I think, you know, our sort of grandparents, not my grandparents, because like you, my grandparents were Jewish on my father's side, but you know, if you go back to the sort of generally in this country, our grandparents were sort of like the church-going generation. The next generation kind of left the church-going bit, but held on to the values. And this generation has kind of, they don't know why those values are there, and therefore they question the whole thing. And that, in a way, for Alpha, to go back to Alpha, I find fascinating, because the people who come on Alpha are so open, because they haven't had the bad experiences of church that so many of their parents had. They're totally open. They're just seeking some kind of spirituality. Everyone is searching, you know, everyone's searching for three things. Everyone's searching for purpose, everyone's searching for love, and everyone's searching to belong. That is like a human condition. And so people are searching for something beyond their material life. They know that there's something greater out there. But on the whole, they want a spirituality without cost. So they're looking for something that can sort of, that they can have almost as a hobby, that can complete all the other areas of their life. What they don't want is something that is sort of radically challenging. And that, of course, the Christian faith and Jesus is radically challenging to our values. But there's a huge part of that. And I think young people are attracted to it. And that's why we find that there are the average age of people coming on Alpha at HTB is 27. And they're just...
And are they, by the way, you know that you've had, Nicky, a fair amount of sort of coverage in the past that says, look, they come from a particular socioeconomic background, they come from a particular kind of community. Is that still the case? Even
it's absolute nonsense. I mean, it is absolute nonsense. It's, you know, all I'd say is something, come and see. I mean, Alpha is, you know, Alpha is running, I think 50,000 men and women did Alpha in the prisons last year. It's running on the Delgado estate. It's running, you know, in every part of society. It's true. It also has run in the House of Parliament and in the White House and in various other places, in universities. But it runs in, you know, right cross-culturally. I mean, you know, if people came to a morning service at HTB, which we were at yesterday, 40% of our morning service is African, 33% is Chinese. It's about the most multicultural experience you will get. It's representative of London. It's hugely multicultural, and which I love. I love the beauty of this sort of diverse world that God has created, and the diverse church. And in heaven, there'll be every tribe, every race represented. And that's what the church does. It brings together people who are so different, you know, like, and I love that. I love that on Alpha, you get a group of people who would never, ever meet in normal life and who come from totally different backgrounds. But, you know, we had in our last Alpha small group online, we had a member of the House of Lords and a couple who live in a caravan, and they got on so well. They were like, they were best friends by the end. And it's like, this is so beautiful, because this is the human race that is loved by God, and it's that they experience this amazing love for one another, which is so
Nicky, I want to bring in Andrew Brown, if I might, because I'm really interested to hear what Andrew has to say. He just did a lovely story about Charlie Wilson and the Independent and the way in which kind of the news goes after religion. And then I'm going to bring in my colleague Matt Dancona, who kind of tends to keep me honest, because often I want everything to be okay, but it's not. There are some conflicts you can't avoid. And then I'm going to come to a few others. But Andrew, do you want to go first?
Yeah. I don't think I need to repeat okay, very shortly. When Charlie Wilson was editing The Independent, and I was his religious affairs correspondent, he demanded that I investigate this sinister cult which had captivated the daughter of, I think it was a duchess he'd been sitting next to at a party. And he wasn't very certain about this, but there was brainwashing involved. And after he'd been ranting for about 10 minutes, I realized he was talking about HTB. And then had the tricky job of telling the editor that he was completely wrong from beginning to end.
But do you think, but Andrew, can I ask you something? Do you think that there is I love the way in which, Nicky starts off by saying, look, it's not something you prove, it's something you experience, faith. And do you think that that simple definition just means that newsrooms, which are, let's face it, overwhelmingly secular, just can't deal with it, can't work out how to handle religion or religious thought in their pages or on their broadcasts?
I think that's quite a large part of it. I think there is also the fact that the religious notion of the sacred and of fact is absolutely crosses right across the journalistic notion. This is quite a complicated thought. I'll send you a piece about it at some stage, but it really is the case that if you regard facts as sacred, you cannot regard as sacred the things that are sacred within religious thought and feeling. There's also, there are cultural things. It is I think in the contemporary London media, you mark yourself out as a weirdo if you're a Christian.
Yeah.
And certainly, that was one of the currents that I moved within.
Nicky, what do you make of that? What do you think about this, about the public discussion of religion?
Well, I think Andrew's right. I mean, I think the media is overwhelmingly secular now, and that's a big shift, really, again over the last 50 years. And it's true here. It's not true in the US. It's not true in Africa. It's not true in many parts of the world, but it has become certainly true in the UK now, and I think even more so in many parts of Western Europe.
And I'm going to try and have it both ways here, which you would expect, Nicky, because I'm going to ask. Inside the newsroom, often at tortoise, we'll have arguments about identity politics, and I'll say, look, maybe there's something good in cancel culture. It's a challenge to the way in which the establishment is thinking. And my colleague, Matt D'Ancona, will say, look, you can't hug everyone, right? Actually, you're going to have to sometimes choose sides. Yeah. And it's clearly the debate, in some areas the debate, some of them around sex, some of them around identity, some of them around loyalty and allegiances, where you do have to choose sides. You can't have it both ways. And so I want to bring Matt in, if I might, Matt, because I just wonder, when you're listening to Nicky and you're thinking about these issues, how you see it.
Well, thank you, and hello, Nicky. I mean, it's nice to talk to you. I mean, I suppose I have a dog in this fight in that I'm a fully paid up member of the liberal universalist atheist club, and I absolutely, as such, I completely support your right to freedom of worship, and I stand outside a place of worship to defend it from anyone that tried to impede that. Having said that, I think that faith is part of the infancy of our species, and that it's I have to say I regard movements like Alpha as a dead cat bounce rather than a renewal. I think if you're countercultural, I'm going to stick with the culture, if that's okay, because I think what you call faith strikes me as not quite what I understand by faith. I mean, you used a very interesting metaphor to talk about courtroom persuasion, and you suggested that what the conclusions that jurors come to are based on faith. I think this is if I may say so, quite a meretricious comparison, because of course what jurors do is the opposite. They are bound by a different covenant, which requires them to take evidence, weigh probabilities, listen to the precedents that are described by the judge, whereas every description of faith that has ever been made involves some sort of, Carl Jung style psychic realignment. So let's not pretend they're the same processes. And I think, at the risk of tipping into, the political, and you made a sort of general Christians are nice plea at the top, and Christians should be at the heart of climate change. Well, yeah, great. But let's actually look at the map now. What is Christianity doing for the planet? Well, in America, for a start, evangelical Christianity is tearing the republic to shreds, rolling back the reproductive rights of women, and giving Trump the best chance he has re-election. So again, I'm sticking with the culture. Sorry about
that. Nicky.
Well, let me just pick you up on the analogy of the jury. I just very quickly on, I'm not here to defend all Christians everywhere. I don't have the truth. No Christian has the truth. No, there's not. There are very different views among Christians in America. I have many friends from all political parties in America, and they don't all agree. And I'm certainly not here to defend anyone who is anti-climate change or any of some of the things that you listed. But let me come to the jury point, because that's what I did before I was ordained. I was a barrister, and I often appeared in front of a jury. The analogy is this: that a jury is making a decision based on effectively historical evidence. It's things that happened in the past which are presented by witnesses, and they have to make a decision whether they believe those witnesses or whether they don't believe them. In other words, it's based on belief, evidence. And I would say that the Christian faith is rational. It's based on evidence. It's not irrational. It's based on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I believe there's good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. You can't prove it in the sense that you can prove a mathematical formula, 2 + 2 = 4, and you can't prove it in a scientific way, but you can prove it in a way that evidence is presented to a jury. That is historical evidence, and it is therefore not irrational. Faith is not a leap into the dark. It is trust of the witnesses to historical facts, the historical facts of the resurrection. So I do think it's analogous to a jury. Of course, you can make distinctions between it, but essentially it's the same thing. It's looking at events that happened in the past, and the jury has to be satisfied so that they're sure based on the evidence. And I think that's the conclusion I came to. I was satisfied on the evidence that I looked at, that Jesus had risen from the dead, and therefore I put my trust in him. And faith is trust. It's trust in evidence. And we're doing that all the time. We are taking steps of faith. Marriage is a step of faith, and faith is therefore very like love. It's something that you can't prove mathematically, but I think we all know it exists.
Matthew, do you want to respond? Oh, hold on, you're muted.
Yes, thanks so much, Nicky. It's fascinating. I mean, I just don't want to go down too much of a cul-de-sac, but you're taking a fairly radical position on the aging of the Gospels there, aren't you? And the synoptics, anyway. You're saying that I assume you tend to the minority view that at least one of the Gospels, the synoptics, was written before the destruction of the temple, on the basis that in order to say what you've said, you must believe that it was written, the tunnel, so to speak, between the death of Jesus Christ and the writing of at least one of the Gospels was written by someone who could conceivably be alive. I mean, I'm just checking that you don't hold to the majority view that the Gospels are actually oral memory written up in the 2nd or 3rd century.
Well, Matthew, I don't like to contradict you, but I don't think that that is the majority view. And I think any theologian who's here, historian, will tell you that the vast majority of biblical critics believe that the Gospels were written in the 1st century, and the 1st century was in living memory of the people and the stories. You know, I can't remember what I did last week, but there are certain things in my life which are like the story that I've told you about what happened to me at university, which I have told over and over and over again. And they become kind of set in your memory because you tell these stories over and over again. And I think the stories in the gospel were like that. The disciples told the stories. Do you remember the feeding of the 5,000? Do you remember when they told those stories over and over again, so that when they came to write them down, admittedly, 30, 40, there's dispute amongst scholars about when the Gospels were written, but there are no scholars that I know of, no reputable scholars who think that they were written in the 2nd or 3rd century. They all believe that they were written in the 1st century, that when they came to be written down, there was something about that was like the memories that I have of 40, 50 years ago, of the things that I have told, you know, the stories I've told about how my wife and I got engaged. I've told that story over and over again. And I think so that is fixed, so that if I came to write it down like 44 years later, I still think it was an accurate reflection of the conversation that took place.
Nicky, can I just take things, if I might, in a slightly different direction? Because I think that it's very funny listening to you and also listening to this conversation between you and Matthew and following the chat, is that I remember not long before he died, we invited Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Sacks, into the newsroom, and this was before the pandemic, so he came in. And it is very similar conversations about religion. There's either the conversation which is it true, right? And then there's another conversation, and this obviously was, if you like, kind of Jonathan Sacks's mastermind subject, which is whether or not it's true, what does it mean? Right?
Yeah.
And I wonder whether we could do a little bit of what it means, because I suspect that lots of people who are taught as members, lots of people who are joining tonight, would say either, look, I believe or I don't believe, but I am worried about the way our world works. I am worried about the way society works. And I kind of look to people like you, Nicky, to have a version of society in the way that Rabbi Sacks did, which made the case for a different set of priorities, a different way of marrying our values with the way in which our society works. And I wonder whether you could just spend a moment or two giving a sense of what that, if you like, the HDB or the Alpha prescription is for society, regardless of whether or not you're a Christian.
Well, if I go back to those three things, purpose, love, belonging, I think that, I mean, for me, the what I'd found in a relationship with God through Jesus was a meaning and purpose, an ultimate meaning and purpose, that this life is not the end. There is a God, that we are created for a relationship with him. And in that relationship, we find the ultimate meaning and purpose of life. And that's what Jesus came to make possible through his death and resurrection. And secondly, love, that we are loved. I think the deepest need of any human being is to know that they're loved. And I think that's what, for me, the experience of an encounter with Jesus was, that to understand that the Son of God, St. Paul wrote, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. That we are so loved, that this is what Easter is all about, that Jesus died for us. That's how much he loves us. And the evidence of that is the cross. And then the experience of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit gives us an experience of God's love. And out of that comes a love for God and a love for other people. And I think that if you wanted to sum up the whole of the New Testament, other than the word Jesus, I would choose the word love. That it's that God loves us, that we love God, and we love one another. and people desperately need love right now, and not love in a kind of just the way in which the world will define love now, but the way in which the New Testament defines it, which is a much more active notion. It's the will, it's action, and that I think is absolutely key. And then belonging. That there's so much loneliness in our world right now. Not just an old person living in a high-rise block of flats, but people who are young people who are standing around in a pub who are actually deeply lonely in this world. And there's something very beautiful about the community of the church. I have found a level of relationship, a level of belonging. And this is what people find on Alpha, is that this connection.
But it's interesting, Nicky, your description there, it's really interesting that the way you talk about that is actually very, very different to the way in which Rabbi Sachs, and there's no reason they should be similar, but it's very different to the way in which he came to see the problem of society, which was, if you read some of his later books, they're not that far away from Mark Carney's book. They're about the fact that our human values seem to have been divorced from our economic, the economic market.
His book Morality, and that
completely.
That's absolutely brilliant book, Morality, absolute genius.
And I just wonder, what you think of that, Nicky? What you think?
I loved his book, Morality. There wasn't a word in it I disagreed with, really. I mean, I just thought it's absolutely brilliant analysis. You know, there is so much overlap between Judaism. I mean, it's the same God, isn't it? It's the same God we worship. The Judeo-Christian faith has the same roots. And, you know, reading that book, I just thought, you express it so much better than I could ever express it. He articulates these things so brilliantly, and his challenges to the culture, I think, are absolutely spot on.
I'm going to bring in, if I can, I don't know whether my colleague Tomini is there, because she made an interesting point about the institutions of the church versus people's faith. I also, I think, sent a message to Robert Leschler. I don't know whether or not, Robert, you're there and able to join us, just because we've spoken before about the way in which the world's experienced the last 18 months and thinks a little differently, and whether you think a little differently about particularly these points about belonging and love, given your work, Robert. I don't know whether, can you weigh in while I'm trying to also get Tomini too?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are, Tomini. Why don't you go first, and I'll Robert in a second. Tomini, what was the point you were making? Was sort of, I couldn't work out whether it was, I'm skeptical about the church, but I am a believer in faith. What were you saying?
I mean, I won't go too much with my experiences with faith, but where I have had doubts in the past, that it has kind of been the church, the physical church, the people that were in the church that maybe weren't acting in a way that was actually aligned with Christianity. And I think it was Liz that said Christianity has stood for things that have been very damaging to society. And while I won't deny that, I think faith is such a, like Nicky's already said, you can't see it, you believe it, you feel it. And I think it's dangerous to say people shouldn't shouldn't have a certain faith because those institutions have committed bad acts, if that makes sense. For example, with Muslims, it's wrong to say that all Muslims are bad or shouldn't be Muslims because we have terrorism. You shouldn't say that people shouldn't be Christians because FGM is being committed in Africa in the name of Christianity, if that makes sense. I think those things should be separated.
Tomini, thank you.
Yeah.
Nicky, what do you think about that? And I've seen, for example, Abby, while Tomini was talking, or at least a little earlier on, was raising the whole question about the institutional behaviour of the church as regards child sex abuse. You'll have seen the report in France in the Catholic Church. How do you approach Christianity and the church? How do you think about those two things separately?
I mean, those things are just so shocking and appalling and tragic. You know, they're shameful, and we should just sickening, really. And but I think we have to just say, well, it's a terrible thing, but it isn't only in the church that we find these things. I mean, insofar as it's in the church, we need to repent. We need to say, I'm just so sorry that that's happened in churches, in Catholic churches, in Protestant churches, in all kinds of churches. But it is prevalent, not just in the churches, it's everywhere in human society. They're finding it in sport, in schools, in institutions of all kinds, and the great themes of the Bible are, and I think this is one of the things that makes sense of our world, is number one, we are created something beautiful about every human being. You look at our world and people are amazing. People are wonderful. People are so gifted. They're kind. God has created a stunning world. And that's the first great doctrine that runs through the whole of the Bible, creation. But then the second one is the fall, that every human being is fallen in some way. And some are more fallen than others. And that includes people in the church, people in religions, people in institutions. And so we shouldn't be totally surprised, but we should be deeply shocked by it. But we are, all of us, I am a sinful human being. I'm a broken, sinful human being. I know that I'm far from perfect. And then the third great doctrine is redemption, that Jesus died for us to redeem us, to make us more Christ-like, more loving, more peaceful, more joyful, kinder, better, more faithful, more self-controlled. And that's what we aspire to, but we've not achieved it. I certainly haven't. And this is a lifelong process. And then glorification is the fourth doctrine, that one day the world will be different. And that's what we're aiming for, is to look beyond this life. So that's how it's fit into the biblical structure.
I'm going to I try to dragoon in Robert Lester, and I'd love to, Robert, if you are there. Are you there, Robert? Let's just see if we can hear you.
Hi, Robert. Oh, you're
can we
mute.
hear you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you well, yeah.
Right, it was very kind of you to draw me in. This is it's an interesting conversation. You don't know my history, but I was very much an evangelical Christian and did lots of dialogue evangelism, and so all the stuff that Nicky's saying is very familiar. And unfortunately now I'm not. I wish I was, in a sense. I wish it was true, but in the end, I felt, sitting as a member of the jury, that the arguments tipped the other way, Nicky. So, but I'm not like a sort of ex-smoker who's vehemently anti-smoking. I wish it was true, and I'm very supportive, and I think you're a wonderful person, do a brilliant job. What I would say is that I think the Christian values, I mean, the Sermon on the Mount, it's really egalitarian stuff. I mean, again, if it was true, it would be brilliant. But unfortunately,
what happened, Robert? What tipped you?
It was a drift. Look, I mean, when I did dialogue evangelism, which is a bit like an alpha course, I would make the arguments very much along the arguments that you've been making, but there was always doubt, because, as you said, you can't be certain. And I suppose just over time, the doubts just overgrew the evidence. So I don't want to get into the reasons why, because I don't want to get into an apologetic debate with you. It wouldn't be a very useful, it wouldn't be a good use of time. But I think the values absolutely are the values we need. I think those values can be propagated without being a Christian, but I mean, the Christian values, I think, in general, I mean, we stayed away from some gender and difficult issues around sexual identity and so on. But in general, I think the Christian values, in terms of how one human being relates to another, are absolutely spot on.
Can I want to, first, I don't want to stay away from those issues about sexual identity and things. I think we should probably hear about those too. Before we do, I just want to do one thing though with you, Robert, which I wonder whether be useful with Nicky too, which is, you know, Robert, we've spoken before about the pandemic, the the culture of care, the nature of community. And I think lots of people have wished that there was a world that sounds more like the one that Nicky described, right? And whether or not you think in the administration of care, in the way the health service works, in the way in which, you know, community works, that the decline of faith has an impact on the way in which society works. And by contrast, Nicky, I wonder whether or not you've reflected on the extent to which actually a secular society has actually shown that it can care without a religious organization that runs through it. I'm going to ask Robert first and then Nicky.
Yeah, well, the world that I've had the privilege to work in for most of my career actually it's a world of care. I mean, the people that I've worked with, most of whom are not Christians, are you know, they get out of bed in the morning to deliver care, and I think there's no real question about that. And I think you've seen a lot of that during the pandemic. I think the thing that exercises me most about our current society is the deep inequalities. And if this pandemic has done one thing, if I was going to accuse this virus of one crime, it would be to exaggerate inequality in almost every form. And so as we emerge from it, what I do see is a social conscience about inequality that I've never actually seen before in such intensity. And I very much hope that we can sustain our level of embarrassment and disquiet about that. And, you know, there's debates about whether Christianity has you know, I think one might well argue that it hasn't worked hard enough to address the inequality issue. And one would say if Jesus actually were real and if he were here, I think he'd set about the task very vigorously. But I think that's something that I'm really encouraged by the level of social disquiet about inequality. We have to turn that now into action.
Yeah.
Nicky.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with Robert. And, you know, faith and doubt are not opposites. They're two sides of the same coin. You cannot have faith without doubt, because it wouldn't be faith. If 2 + 2 = 4, there is no doubt. We've invented those symbols so that there's absolute certainty about it. It doesn't require any faith to believe in it. But faith will always be open to doubt, just as love is always open to doubt. You cannot prove love. You know, you can't prove that your wife loves you. You can believe it, you can feel it, you can sort of know it in your heart, but you can't prove it logically. It's always open to doubt. And I think all the things that are most important in life are always open to doubt, and therefore there's always this element of faith. As far as the teaching of Jesus is concerned and the values, I think it is extraordinary that when you think in the last 2,000 years, if you even think in the last 10 years, how much technology has improved. What has happened to this in the last 10 years? Think what's happened in extraordinary advances. Yet in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the teaching of Jesus. You love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemy. Do to others as you would have them do to you. No one has ever bettered it.
Can I ask you one thing? Because I did want to pick up on the point that about sexuality and identity, and I know this is one of those things. I didn't want to come on to it early because I think often those conversations about faith get entirely kind of sidelined by this issue. But I remember Andrew Adonis wrote a brilliant piece when I was at the Times years ago, where his criticism of the Church of England around its objections to gay marriage were, this is such an odd thing for the church of all institutions to have a problem with, given that above all things, the church is making the case for love. And if any institution should be trying to enable relationships of love, it should be the church. And so I wondered how you think about this and how you think the church advances so that all people who love feel as though they've got a home in the church.
Well, everybody should be welcome in every church, regardless of their anything really. I mean, the church. I mean, I would want to claim the word inclusive because I think the church should be inclusive in its welcome to every human being, And that's the whole point of the church. Jesus welcomed everyone, and he particularly went to the people who were on the margins of society and welcomed them and loved them. And no one should ever be rejected by the church because of any of those issues, whether it's ethnicity or sexuality or any other reason. The church must be a totally welcoming, loving environment for everyone.
And Nicky, can I just ask you, sorry to press you, but what do you think that when you say totally welcoming, because it's one thing to be not to be rejected. I think we should all agree no one should be rejected, but totally welcoming means totally welcoming, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does mean totally welcoming. It doesn't mean that I mean that's a different issue to what the church teaches on various moral issues. The church has views on moral issues which are not always the same as the secular world around it, and right now that the church has different views. It's no longer the case. 50 years ago, the church was pretty much uniform in its views on many of these issues. Right now, that there are divisions. There are different views, and there's a debate going on within the church. And what St. Paul said about things that were kind of not at the heart of the not things like the resurrection or the deity of Jesus or things that are absolutely essential, is where there are things that are where there are different views. He said three things. First of all, everyone should be convinced in their own conscience. So each person has to work out what they think about the things where there's division in the church. Secondly, we should respect one another. There are people on the different sides of the debate who would argue their case on the basis of justice. Others will base it on the truth or unity or a different type of justice, racial justice, listening to the views of people on the other, not just listening to the Western church, but listening to the whole global church, and not just listening to one particular part of the church, but listening to the Catholic Church and listening to other parts of the church. So there's a debate going on right now, as you know, and but Paul's view, what Paul set out in Romans 14, is where there are these divisions, everybody has to make up their own mind. Mm-hmm. And we then have to have discussions about them, but they should be respectful discussions. And he says, live at peace, as far as possible, live at peace with one another. Yeah. Don't kind of fall out personally over these things, discuss them, debate them, they're important. But at the same time, in my view, we need to get on with, we mustn't get bogged down in some of these debates. We need to get on with what Jesus commissioned us to do, which was to go and bring this is good news. That's why I feel passionately about Alpha. That's why I'm on my 95th Alpha small group in a row, is because it's good news and we want people to encounter Jesus, be filled with the Spirit, and then they can make up their own mind according to their own conscience about the issues that they face.
Well, Nicky, I found it completely fascinating listening to you, and actually I'd love it to go on for ages. I can see there are a fair few people kind of smiling and nodding who feel much the same. I want to finish, if I can, by asking you one question, which is not about good news, not about what Jesus said, but about what Holy Trinity Brompton does, what about the Alpha does. Because when I was reading up today, thinking about talking to you, I was imagining to myself that there's someone somewhere who's pitched doing a Harvard Business Review study of Alpha on the basis that it's hard to imagine an organization that wins over so many people in so many places, so many different age groups. And I just wondered whether, for all of us thinking about how we create communities, how we participate in groups, what it is that you think, and this may seem a ridiculous thing to ask, but what it is, putting aside the faith, that the community at HTB does, or that the people who participate in Alpha courses actually do for each other? Is it, and I don't want it into kind of highfalutin a way, I mean literally, is it like caring for kids? Is it community activities? What is it that you do together that you think binds people in?
I mean, I think there are a number of things. Funny enough, in some ways, it's quite similar to this, because what you're doing here is hosting a discussion where people listen respectfully to one another of different views. And I think that's the way people want to explore issues today. They don't want the sort of vicious fighting, but they want, and they don't want to be preached at, but they want to discuss and explore for themselves, and discuss in a rational way with people who are very different from themselves and have very different views. And that's what basically happens in an Alpha small group, which is why it's infinitely fascinating. But I think beyond that, people are drawn to the passion to make a difference in our world. You know, since the beginning of the pandemic, we started a little thing called Love Your Neighbor, which has provided over 18 million meals across the country, working with other churches. Love Christmas, where last year we did 775,000 Christmas gifts, many of them to people who wouldn't receive any other gift at Christmas. This year we're aiming for 1 million gifts at Christmas. The church is out, you know, we run a homeless shelter. People love to you know, there's no greater joy than working with the homeless. There's no greater joy than going into the prisons, actually, and bringing good news to people in prison. There's no greater joy than helping someone get out of debt. There's no greater joy than going to visit someone who's lonely and on their own. There's no greater joy. And the greatest joy of all is see somebody find meaning and purpose in life, and find love and find joy, finding marriages restored, finding, you know, reconciliation and relationships. I mean, I've got the best job in the world. I can't imagine how anyone can have a better job than I get actually paid to do this. And it's the most, not very much because it's the Church of England, but it's just the most amazing job, and it's the most amazing community. And I'm surrounded by the most wonderful people who are giving their life. Jesus said, life is not about getting, it's about giving. It's much more blessed to give than to receive. And this is a community that's discovered that they're out giving, serving the community, making a difference in people's lives, encouraging one another, building one another. It's an atmosphere where people can come in and without any sort of fear that they're going to be confronted or attacked, but they know that they're going to be loved, encouraged, and find hope. People are desperate for hope and meaning and purpose and peace in the midst of a world of huge anxiety. It's just, yeah.
Nicky, I'm sitting here smiling away, almost despite myself. Alex, I'm looking at a number of different faces. I don't know whether this is one of the things I really love about these screens. You can watch people grinning away. I have to say that I'm smiling away, not least because I'm thinking to myself, actually, one of the joys of Tortoise is that you can on one day be having a conversation about religion, Christianity, and the nature of community, and then, you know, the end of last week doing inflation and interest rates, and tomorrow how do you structure a carbon tax.
That's interesting also. That's another interesting
discussion. We'll look forward to that. A big and heartfelt thank you to you.
Oh, no.
I know that you don't do these things very often, but it's really fascinating to hear it, and I hope I have the chance for people with different views to put them to you. There's been a great conversation in the chat too, and to everyone who's joined Tortoise either for the first time or many times, thank you for sparing the time to be with us. Nicky, we can't well, I was going to say we can't give you a round of applause, but being from the church, we're used to that. So anyway, we can know where you have your way.
But I've really enjoyed it, James. I've hugely enjoyed meeting you, and I'm longing to hear more about your roots, your Jewish roots, and to compare notes and see how our families may have known each other back in the day. But also, thank you. I've really enjoyed the highly intelligent, articulate sort of questions and comments. And what a fascinating group of people. And this is what it sort of reminds me of a slightly large alpha group, basically. And this is exactly the kind of points that are always raised, because alpha is for people outside the church, and it's exactly the kind of points that are always raised by the guests on alpha, and that's what makes me love it. I love to hear a different point of view and to be able to discuss and debate and listen respectfully, hopefully, to different points of view.
Nicky, thank you very much. Absolutely. And for everyone here, we're headed to Glasgow from tomorrow. So come and join us and we'll see where we can make some sense of that, listening respectfully, as you say. Thanks all. Have a very good evening. Thanks everyone for your time.